Okay, so now we should be live both on Zoom and on YouTube. So hello everybody again. My name is Julian Tucker. I'm a research associate here at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Nordic office. Today we have with us some very distinguished guests, but first I'm going to pass the floor to our director, Gabriele Baumann. Gabriele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julian. I would also like to welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, our office in the Nordic countries. The Arctic is a unique region, which we at the CAS Nordics have been focusing on for quite a long time now, with discussion rounds and conferences in all 5 countries of the European Arctic, as well as in Brussels and Ukraine. And I'm welcoming you on the topic of today, the security in the Arctic after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The Arctic is being transformed by climate change, which brings with it many implications for the future of the region with regard to potential free shipping routes, access to resources, and the security environment. The Northern Sea route is of key national interest for Russia. Russia's naval and military build-up inside the Arctic has been an issue for many years now. And also non-Arctic states are trying to get a foothold in the region. China has been playing an increasingly active role. The presence of more Arctic stakeholders, as I said, from China's near Arctic status to the European Union's new strategy, is raising questions about future of Arctic governance. And Arctic governance is at the same time being challenged to a very large extent after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as the cooperation within the Arctic Council has been put on hold, and so have many projects, also scientific projects, research projects put on hold. The window of opportunity to address future governance issues in the High North with Russia seems to be closed. The Arctic history of low tension and international cooperation cannot be taken for granted anymore. Geopolitical dynamics are dramatically changing. At our today's webinar, we therefore want to look at some of the most pressing questions about security in the Arctic. Can we draw any long-term conclusions about the war's implication for the Arctic? Can we still speak about an Arctic exceptionalism? The war has already pushed Finland and Sweden towards NATO. Or will there maybe be an ice curtain dividing the Arctic between Russia, China, and European Arctic, 5 Nordic countries, US and Canada? Some experts say that. How will generally changes in European security policy following the Russian invasion of Ukraine affect the Arctic? We speak in German of the so-called Zeitenwende, a word which is already, as a German word went into other languages, change of time. So many questions we would like to discuss with you today within 1 hour. But now I would like to leave the floor again to my colleague Julian Tucker, who has been introduced already, and he will introduce our 2 panelists from Sweden and Iceland, and then direct the discussion. Julian, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So I'm back again. Thank you very much, Gabriele, for those opening words. As Gabriele just mentioned, today we want to talk about security policy in the Arctic. And to help us do that, we have 2 very distinguished, very knowledgeable, and very great speakers, which I will quickly introduce. Then I will seize my moderatorial privilege to direct some questions to them. And then we will take questions from the audience. If you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to use the Q&A function. If you are watching live on YouTube, you can also comment, and I will try to amalgamate the questions and direct them at the panelists, so we don't end up having too many questions in too many places at the same time. You can also comment on and upvote other questions. So when you ask questions, please bear in mind that these are public in this setup. So first, we have with us today Major General Mats Engman. Mats commissioned into the Swedish Air Force in 1976 and has many years of experience in the Swedish military, as well as in joint and international operations. His most recent posting overseas was as the head of the Swedish delegation to the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission on the Korean Peninsula, where he served from 2014 to 2017. Since then, he's been a distinguished military fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy here in Stockholm, Sweden. And then we have with us, and I'm very sorry about the pronunciation, Gudbjörg Riki Thoroddsen Hauksdotter. Been practicing a lot, but I think I still missed the mark just a little bit, who is a PhD student at the University of Iceland in Iceland. Riki holds a BA in Chinese Studies and an MA in International Relations also from the University of Iceland, and has previously worked as a program manager at the Arctic Center, also at the University of Iceland, at the Institute of International Affairs in Iceland. Sorry about that, Riki. Okay, so first I'll pass the floor to you, Mats. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you for inviting me together with my colleague from Iceland for this hopefully interesting webinar. I will center my presentation around 4 issues: European policies, some military-related activities, as mentioned, Ukraine spillovers, and try to talk a little bit about the way forward. But let me first, some very, very few basic facts. There are 8 member nations in the Arctic Council, of which 6, including Russia then, are European nations. And there are also 8 out of 13 European non-Arctic nations with observer status in the Arctic Council. So it's very obvious that Arctic developments are of key interest and concern to Europe, and particularly, of course, to countries in Northern. The Arctic Council was established in 1996 as a multilateral cooperative institution. It's not treaty-based, centered around the protection of the Arctic environment, to promote the sustainable development, and to protect the indigenous population. Its terms of reference does not include discussions and action on security and military-related issues, and I will come back to this later. So, first, European policies. Most of the European Arctic and non-Arctic nations have policies and strategies on Arctic developments that highlights the region's unique characteristics and the importance to protect this. Looking closer to some of these policies, I have, for this seminar, selected Sweden and Norway as 2 members of the Arctic Council, as well as UK and Germany, non-Arctic members, but with observer status, searching for commonalities and differences. So if we look closer at Sweden, Sweden's current Arctic policy or Arctic strategy was adopted in 2020. Most of the document covers traditional Swedish foreign policy with a focus on human rights, to contribute to peaceful and sustainable development, and democracy and legal principles should underpin any kind of international cooperation. The government put priority on 5 thematic areas when it comes to its Arctic policy: international cooperation, security and stability, climate and the environment, polar research and environmental monitoring, and sustainable economic development. It does recognize the changing geopolitical realities that creates new challenges and changing conditions for Swedish Arctic policy. The last point is evident in the chapter on security and stability, where the government recognizes an increased military dynamic in the region that carries a risk for an arms race and incidents, and a need to improve and deepen transatlantic as well as European partnerships to better address those risks. It also highlights that Sweden will improve its national Arctic defense capabilities marginally, I would say, to be better able to contribute to that type of stability. Norway. Norway's Arctic policy revolves around security, stability, and interest-based international cooperation, much like Sweden. Norway believes that foreign and domestic policy converge in the Arctic. The government puts strong focus on the economic growth and future-oriented jobs for the north of Norway, that is, stating it is a matter of national interest. It continues to state that for Norway, the Arctic has strategic significance, and to further develop North Norway economically, infrastructure, education, etc., is the best way to safeguard Norwegian interest in the Arctic. Norway emphasizes the importance of the rule of law, including UNCLOS, which provides the legal framework according to Norwegian thinking, and strong multilateral structures. Norway further considers the Arctic its most important area of strategic responsibility. Some of the main features of the policy are to maintain a consistent and predictable approach. And in this part of the document, you can find a lot of words on security and defense related consideration. And Norway has for many, many years strengthened its defense capability in the High North. And a substantial part of the Norwegian defense forces are in peacetime deployed in the North. Further in this document, they talk about the benefits of cooperation, climate change, of course, to work according to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, job creation, technological developments, and the protection of indigenous communities. Moving over to some of the non-Arctic nations, so starting with the UK, who maybe is the most articulate of the non-Arctic European nations. Already in 2013, London put forward its first dedicated Arctic policy, and a major review took place in 2018. But it's only in the latest policy document, the UK's defence contribution in the High North, published this year, in which security and defence-related issues are discussed at any depth. UK policy rests on three principles: respect, cooperation, and leadership, and a strong focus on promoting science, protecting the environment, and promoting prosperity. The defense-related policies talk about protecting critical national infrastructure, freedom of navigation, reinforcing UNCLOS, and contesting malign and destabilizing behaviors. To achieve this, London stresses the need for improved situation awareness, intelligence gathering, various partner arrangements like NATO and the Joint Expeditionary Force, maintaining a presence in the region, and develop capabilities for the High North. London also stresses the region's impact on security for the more regional North Atlantic, Northern Europe, and Baltic region. Germany. Germany's primary interest in the Arctic region focuses on overall stability, geopolitically, economically, and environmentally. The most recent policy document, the 2019 revised version of the Guidelines on Germany's Arctic Policy, referenced the preservation of unhindered access to trade routes, preempting conflict, and dedicated an entire chapter to geopolitical security concerns. Berlin seems keen to promote the multilateral and potentially European approach to Arctic affairs, as indicated by its focus on collaborative projects, including training exercises with the Netherlands Navy and a surveillance flight project with France. However, even though Berlin is emphasizing a peaceful Arctic, Berlin seems concerned that great power competition is taking a hold in the Arctic at an increased speed. As such, Berlin is currently seeking to improve its surveillance capability for Arctic operations. And we are likely to see Berlin to be more visible in the Arctic and align its efforts much closer with other partners such as France, Norway, and the Netherlands, rather than remaining adamant on the peaceful Arctic narrative. The major policy change in Germany following the war in Ukraine may result in an even more visible Germany in the Arctic. But I would also caution that judging from current political debate in Germany, it may take many, many years before any substantial increase in military capabilities can be fielded by the Bundeswehr. It is obvious both the European Arctic and non-Arctic nations have a growing interest in Arctic developments, and I would argue most are reasonable and legitimate interest. Trying to turn to some of the military aspects. Military activities in and around the Arctic has increased over the last 5 to 10 years, both from Russia from NATO and individual NATO countries. Russia has repeatedly conducted long-range flights along the Norwegian coastline with nuclear-capable Tu-160, conducted GPS jamming, and held naval and missile exercises north of Murmansk. NATO has increased exercises in the area as well, like Trident Juncture in 2018, Cold Response 2020 and 22, the latter being twice as large as Cold Response 2020, totaling some 30,000 soldiers. And just recently, mid-May, Red Flag Alaska, a 10-day air combat exercise was completed from bases in Alaska with UK and Canadian Air Forces joining the US Air Force. Individual nations in Europe are putting more emphasis on improving warfare capabilities in Arctic climate, and because of the harsh condition, real-life training in the area is needed because it's very difficult to use simulators to train operations at minus 30 degrees Celsius. With continued climate change affecting the Arctic exponentially, the area becomes more and more accessible, and we are likely to see an increase in all types of human and commercial activities, including military activity. Climate change will also affect the operational environment, and some of Russia's natural defenses, the ice cap in the area, are slowly melting away. Russia is, both as a consequence of the increased commercial research and military activity and to protect its nuclear deterrence, improving its defense capabilities in the area. Remember, Russia has 53% of the Arctic coastline. Examples of such improvements are the establishment of an Arctic Joint Strategic Command, the creation of an Arctic Brigade, the decision to elevate the Northern Fleet to a military district, and the newly constructed icebreaker capable of carrying the cruise missile Caliber, and several infrastructure projects to support military deployments and operations in the area. NATO, on the other hand, has not a clearly formulated Arctic strategy yet. In the latest summit meeting press release from Brussels 2021, only one vague reference to the Arctic was made. But we do believe that the current strategic concept being developed for the summit in Madrid later in June will contain reference to Arctic, and Arctic will play a more prominent role in that document. Some words on possible fallout from the war in Ukraine, and I will highlight 5 points. There are many, many more, of course. There is a major shift that's already been mentioned in European security and defense policy. Sweden and Finland has applied for NATO membership. Germany announced several changes in its security policy. Sweden and Germany have decided to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP. Europe moves from building security with Russia to building security against Russia, as a colleague from the Defense Research Institute said at another Arctic venue. We also have a more isolated and encircled Russia that is difficult to trust for years to come, but still the major Arctic power. Arctic governance, as we know it, will become a challenge. And this challenge, I think, is much more fundamental than a temporary pause. Russia's military conventional power will be further degraded, and especially the ground forces, from the war in Ukraine. And the relative importance of nuclear capability and maritime power will increase, making the Murmansk area, from a Russian perspective, an even more vital national security interest. And Russia will, I think, be more sensitive to potential provocations and or threats to the Murmansk area. And I think Ricky will come back to this, but I think that Russia likely will be more dependent on China, especially in finance and technology, and that in turn will increase Beijing's leverage over Russia, and that may translate to more Chinese influence over Arctic developments. And finally, there is a small risk of a horizontal escalation of the war in Ukraine to other geographical areas, like the Arctic. To summarize, we will have to deal with an erratic, unpredictable, and a Russia we cannot trust. And we will witness a continued increase in military activity in the Arctic, including from European Arctic and non-Arctic nations. And the fallout from the war in Ukraine will add momentum to this development. And to answer one of the questions raised in the introduction, I think the era of Arctic exceptionalism is over, finally. A few words on the way forward. So what possible action can we discuss to reduce the risk I've addressed of the Arctic turning into an area of confrontation and militarization? I have 3 proposals. I think as more countries are becoming engaged and have legitimate interest, there is a need to find a way to channel that interest and give these nations both impact incentives to contribute to peaceful development. And I would suggest developing something I call observer status 2.0. The military activities I've highlighted are likely to intensify. So there's a need to establish a working forum to discuss and possibly agree on any type of code of conducts, risk reduction mechanism, confidence building mechanism, and in general, increase transparency. One option is to reintroduce an updated format of what was previously the Arctic CHOD meetings, including this time participation of non-Arctic nations. Another version would be to develop an Arctic Vienna document, inclusive setting rather than exclusive. And I don't think NATO is the proper facilitator for those options. And the last point, do not isolate or distance China in Arctic issue. Try to reduce China's dependence on Russia and give it a word or a seat, but no exclusive rights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mats. I think you raised some great points. But before we dive into those a little bit more deeply, we'll pass the word to Rike. Rike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here with you today. So today we'll go briefly over both Iceland's position as an Arctic state in this current security environment, as well as discuss how the situation might affect China in the Arctic region. And finally, I will discuss briefly the implications for China-Iceland relations. So I will do my best to stay within the 10 minutes time limit, but feel free to ask me any questions during the Q&A. So let's look at Iceland and Arctic security. So Iceland is one of the 8 Arctic states and had chairmanship in the Arctic Council prior to Russia. Iceland is also a NATO member and a member of the founding states of NATO and has a bilateral defense agreement with the US. That being said, generally there has been very limited discussion on security in Iceland domestically, the reasons for which are both historical, political, and cultural. One of those reasons being that Iceland mostly outsourced its security issues to the US until 2006, when the US closed the Keflavik army base unilaterally, an army base which had been operational from the Second World War. Iceland has a free trade agreement with China, and the 2 states have enjoyed good economic relations and generally good political relations. And when it comes to Russia, Iceland has historically also held quite stable relations with Russia. And it's worth mentioning that sanctions against Russia after the annexation of Crimea was quite controversial domestically, as it was in many other European countries, as it impacted our fishing exports. But it's also worth mentioning that the discussion after the invasion of Ukraine this year is very different. Iceland follows the EU sanctions and has strongly condemned Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And as I mentioned, the invasion has prompted an unprecedented discussion in Iceland about security issues. An example of how unprecedented this is that during the parliamentary elections to Alþingi last year, the discussion on foreign policy was almost non-existent, except a few mentions of the EU, while the discussion on security was absolutely non-existent. Not one word on security was uttered. So since then, as with many other European states, the focus politically and in the media has been on security. For example, our Prime Minister, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, whose party, the Left Greens, is the only party in Iceland opposed to NATO membership. She has stated that she would welcome Sweden and Finland into NATO, thereby accepting NATO enlargement. Furthermore, she has said that Iceland will increase its spending on cybersecurity, humanitarian aid, as well as Icelanders should expect increased NATO presence in Iceland on all fronts, earth, water, and sea. This is obviously a shift from the Left Greens' policy on opposing Iceland's participation in NATO. Another example of this discussion is that while she was acting Minister for Foreign Affairs, Áslaug Arna Sigurbjörnsdóttir, our Minister for University, Industry and Innovation, stated that she would not rule out that the Keflavik Army base would be reopened, but later stated that there were no concrete plans for reopening the base. But on top of this, there's a robust discussion on security, on Icelandic television, radio, as well as newspapers. Nevertheless, how much funding will truly go into security issues will be seen in the following months and obviously years as well. And people in Iceland are worried about Iceland's security in general, as Iceland is a state without a military and thus heavily reliant on both NATO and the US for its security. And also, Iceland is a small state that relies on international institutions to advance its interests. It goes without saying that the Arctic is extremely important in this context, as any changes in the Arctic security environment would impact Iceland heavily. Now I will move over to China, but happy to discuss Iceland further during our Q&A. So I will briefly go over China's current relations with Russia. China and Russia have had a strategic partnership from 2019 and held numerous joint military exercises from 2015. Xi Jinping has called Putin his closest and most intimate friend. And Russia has signed an MOU on the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia thereby being the only Arctic state which has signed up for the initiative. On the 4th of February, the two states issued a joint statement, which is called International Relations Entering a New Era at the Global Sustainable Development. As many of you might already know, in this joint statement, it states that the two countries' relations knows no limits, that the states will work more closely on security issues, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, as well as they condemn the so-called NATO enlargement. In this context, the Arctic region is specifically mentioned twice. The statement mentions that the Arctic should be sustainably developed, its routes developed and used, and that transport should be strengthened. Although it focuses on transport, I find it very interesting that the Arctic is specifically addressed, especially in such a security-oriented document. On top of this, a week before the invasion of Ukraine, the two states made large deals on China buying of Russian wheat and gas. Nevertheless, it is worth keeping in mind that historically there has also obviously been high level of untrust between the two states. But over the past few years, China and Russia have signed numerous deals on the oil and gas, but around a third of all oil and gas exports of Russia go to China. And China is Russia's largest trading partner, but Russia is China's 12th largest trading partner. So when it comes to China's stance towards the invasion, perhaps it's needless to say to this audience, but China does not participate in the sanctions against Russia and did not condemn Russia in the UN Security Council for the invasion of Ukraine, despite pressure from the West. And when it comes to Chinese foreign policy, China has over many decades emphasized that sovereignty must be respected and states should not intervene in internal matters of other states. It is therefore difficult for China to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine domestically, as Putin calls the Ukrainian government Nazis and junkies as justification for the invasion. So what has happened domestically in the Chinese media is this emphasis on a single military exercise, and we know this rhetoric comes from the Kremlin, on NATO enlargement, on the so-called complex historical security environment of Ukraine, as well as stating that the US military equipment manufacturers make a lot of money off the invasion. So when it comes to China's involvement in the invasion, the story in the Chinese state media to the domestic market goes somewhat this way. While the US sent weapons to Ukraine, China sends humanitarian aid to Ukrainian citizens. While the West sanctions Russia, China emphasizes a dialogue. While the West wants to cut off relations with Russia, China focuses on mutual understanding between all parties. So thereby the CCP is trying to present itself as a beacon of peace and hope to the Chinese public while swaying from any discussion on sovereignty. Nevertheless, the Chinese government does not want to push the West too hard, as there are high interests at stake. The US is China's largest trading partner, followed by the EU as a whole, while, as I mentioned, Russia is China's 12th largest trading partner. So I believe China's red line is not to be sanctioned along Russia, and therefore China has been playing the stance between being neutral and taking a stance. So what are the possible implications for China when it comes to Arctic politics? China is obviously reliant on Russia for access to the region. So in the Arctic region, the China-Russia relationship is not as balanced as it is in some other regions, because, as Max mentioned, Russia is a powerhouse in the Arctic Council member state, while China is an observer to the Arctic Council. So I think China needs to tread carefully and not to scare Russia off so China loses its access to the region. China became an observer to the Arctic Council in 2013, but Russia was quite hesitant at first to grant China access to the region. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, Russia has signed the Belt and Road Initiative Framework Agreement, being the only Arctic state to have done so. So what are the implications for Iceland-China relations? It is still early days for Arctic politics in this changed security environment. And we have yet to see, of course, the long-term implications of the relations in the Arctic region. So I would like to be careful before saying anything too definite. But I'm going to say just a few final words about China-Iceland relations in the region. I think with Iceland and, of course, many other countries, that the invasion of Ukraine has shaken many people and impacted numerous states to refocus on security. My feeling for what has happened in Iceland is increased political will to enhance Iceland's security, as well as general goodwill from the Icelandic public. I believe that Iceland and China relations have moved from the so-called golden era of relations at the time of the free trade agreement in 2014 to a more politically complex era. The reasons for that are threefold. Obviously, China stands to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's also increased discussion in Iceland about Chinese human rights abuses, for example, against the Uyghur minority. And there's also pressure from the United States not to engage further with China in the Arctic region. An example of that were two high-level visits in 2019 by Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, where Iceland was pressured not to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, and China's presence in the Arctic was specifically discussed. But I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thank you.
Oh, that was great, Enrique. So don't worry about going over time. So thank you both, Enrique and Mats. I very much appreciated that you guys numbered a lot of your points, so I was feverishly writing along. I want to encourage everybody listening on Zoom or on YouTube. On YouTube, you'll have a slight delay. You'll be 30 seconds behind those of us on Zoom, but you can still ask intelligent questions that I can then direct towards our speakers. But I've also prepared some questions of my own, and there are a couple of points that I wanted to seize upon that you guys had mentioned just now. So first, both of you had talked about this transformation in European security policy that we're seeing. Gabriele had mentioned in the beginning that in Germany, we talk a lot about a Zeitenwende, changing the times. Sweden and Finland have taken the decision to join the NATO alliance. In Denmark, tomorrow, I believe, there'll be a referendum on abolishing their opt-out out of the European security policy framework, which is also a big step for Denmark and might also resonate a little bit in the Arctic. But even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, we already saw signs of a more maybe energetic set of policies towards the Arctic. Mats, you had mentioned that particularly the British had, or the UK had been publishing its strategies. Of course, Sweden has as well, and even Germany, a country that most people don't necessarily think of when they think of the Arctic, has developed different policy positions. So my first of many, many questions to you guys would be, to what extent do these policies align with one another? Do they conflict at all, or are there differences in vision, or do we begin to see kind of a division of labor? What's your read on the different strategies? Maybe Mats, we could have you first. And if you're talking, I think you may still be muted.
Yeah. No, I can start. Sure, Julian. And when I've been looking closer to these 4 or 5 policies that I mentioned, I've also looked a little bit closer to the French policy, and looking for similarity and difference. I don't think there is a lot of differences in the area which I have kind of focused on, which is the security, the military side of the documents. I think the differences that you can distinguish is more to do with when the policies were drafted and decided upon. Because there is a shift. If you look in the policies that were maybe drafted before, let's say 2020, like the British and the French, and to a certain degree the German, they have less focus on, let's say, the geopolitical spillovers into the Arctic, where the Arctic uniqueness and the peaceful developments are an issues on environmental protection of the indigenous population, etc. Research have a stronger focus. But if you look at the policies that has been drafted and adopted more recently, like the Swedish, for instance, and the last British, the defense contribution, they contain very similar language on the risks. But what I miss in the documents is that I have very strong problems finding any kind of recipe and discussions on how to address the risks. What do you do with a non-cooperative Russia? I mean, we know since 2014 that there was a risk after the invasion of Crimea. So these documents are, and I foresee that you will have a debate in many countries, like in Iceland and other serious Arctic nations, about what do we do in order to address the risk we are now facing with a kind of handicapped Arctic Council, with a non-cooperative Russia, with the Russia we cannot trust, with the risk of militarization, the risk of provocation, incidents, etc. I don't have a good answer to that. But what I see is a need to develop an alternative or improved governance model for the Arctic that is not solely reliant on one institute like the Arctic Council.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a very good point. I think, Mats, you also brought up in your discussion, and I think Rike echoed this a little bit, that some of these policy documents identify malign and destabilizing behavior as a potential problem in the region, right? And at the same time, you mentioned, Mats, in your discussion on Russia, that there'll be an increase, or due to the increased focus in Russian tactical or strategic thinking of the Navy and the missile forces, that there'll be an increased sensitivity about Murmansk, right? The sort of key military city on the Kola Peninsula in sort of Arctic Russia. I wanted to ask about military, and I wanted to ask both of you about military exercises taking place in the Arctic, right? Since February 24th, there've been several exercises, including Cold Response, which you mentioned, Mats, was much larger than its predecessor 2 years previously. And then on Iceland, we had, I think it's called Viking Defense 2022. What do these exercises tell us about strategic thinking in the Nordic countries, in the West, more abstractly, thinking about the United States and Canada and the transatlantic relationship? And how are these exercises being perceived by the local people? Many of the exercises, particularly, I think Northern Viking brought with it goodwill visits by NATO vessels from the US, from the UK, and as well as from Germany. So if you guys could pick up that theme a little bit, that would be great. Maybe Mats?
Okay, I can try to start, and first to address the exercises in itself. I mean, all of these exercises that NATO and NATO individual countries, including the JEF exercises, have all, as far as I know, been exercises with a scenario of an Article 5 type of situation or high intensity warfare. And I think this is an illustration of both an understanding in Brussels at the NATO headquarters and in individual NATO countries up in the high north, that there is an increased tension in the area, and that NATO has for many years been more in international operations, anti-terrorist operation, and there is a kind of it's payback time in order to get NATO's forces up to the standard that is needed for high intensity conventional warfare. And these exercises up in the high north has had that as a kind of backdrop scenario. I was myself exercise director in 2018 for the Swedish contribution in that exercise. So it's been very clear that it's been an exercise designed to develop high intensity warfare capability, but also the regional understanding and the conditions, because the conditions to conduct serious military operations up in the high north in the Arctic is very different from a winter warfare. And so many of the forces from UK, US, Germany, France have a limited capability, both when it comes to the personal equipment, the heavy equipment, and how do you operate in -30 without losing the combat age. When it comes to local population, I can only speak for Sweden because I don't have an insight in the other countries, that generally speaking, there was very limited demonstrations or opposition, but contrary, I think it was welcome up in the northern part, even from a Swedish perspective, to have NATO forces operated or exercising in Sweden.
Thank you. Ricky, could you maybe comment on?
Is different. Yeah.
Yes, maybe I can say just a few words about the local perspective on these exercises. Well, as I mentioned, the discussion has been quite limited up until now, except for among people that are very interested in security or international relations. So previously, the past few years, there has been limited attention to these exercises, or they're quite negative attitudes towards them. But now there's obviously more attention paid to the exercises, but I believe they're not as negative. There were some protests. I think it was last month, but it was very small. So I think, people are thinking a bit differently about Iceland's security now, at least locally.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions from the audience, but before we take those, I just want to ask one final question, and I'm thinking of you specifically here, Ricky, but Mats, feel free to jump in as well. You mentioned, Ricky, that there had been a lot of or there'd been a history of distrust between China and Russia, and that it was really Russia that sort of blocked or that was hostile to the idea of China becoming involved in the Arctic, right, or becoming too involved in the Arctic. But then that opposition was sort of removed over time. So my first question is, what happened? Maybe you can go into that a little bit more in broad terms. And my second question is, since 2018, China refers to itself as a near Arctic state, correct? I was hoping you could, just a few sentences, tell us, why is China's Arctic policy different from, say, Japan or South Korea's, or Germany's, France's, the UK's? Why is that label or that moniker of a near Arctic state special? Of course, Mats, feel free to jump in as well.
Thank you for the question. And there are, of course, quite a few ways to analyze this, but I think the talk of a near Arctic state has gone a bit under the radar and is not as prominent as it was a few years ago. I think because also it was so controversial, and some of you might remember Mike Pompeo's speech in Rovaniemi in 2019, where he said that there were only Arctic state and non-Arctic states, and that China said something different, didn't give them, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but that didn't grant them access to anything, or so basically that there are only Arctic and non-Arctic states. And I think at the time of China's application to become an observer state, there was this general goodwill in Europe and elsewhere towards China. It was still thought that that through trade, China would become more democratic. We have seen that this is not the case. And during those 9 years, we have seen a deterioration in relations with China from the West. I think that Moscow's opposition at the time shows that all of the two states declare that their relations have no limits. They actually do, and that there is no complete trust, as you mentioned. The reason for this change is just a part of what I am analyzing in my PhD, but maybe too early to discuss right now, but hopefully later. Hopefully I can give you more concrete answers later.
We'll come back to you on that. Okay, now I think maybe in the interest of time, we'll jump to some of the questions from the Q&A. Larissa Stünke of the Institute for Security Development Policy asks, how should the Arctic Council deal with Russia in the near future? What are the options within the Council to be both open to engagement and to draw clear boundaries? And then maybe I can throw in another question here just to collect. Griffin Ballinger asks, directed primarily at Mats, but anybody can answer. Does Nordefco have any common Arctic policy positions that play a role in securitization of the region? Then we have some more questions, but let's start with those two.
Okay, if I should try to start with that, Julian. On the question of Nordefco, as far as I know, Nordefco has no policy on Arctic or any Arctic strategy. Nordefco is a cooperative arrangement to really deal with forced development and training and education. It has no kind of political role. It may, when the ministerial meetings happen, issue some kind of statements, but the cooperation does not include any kind of secretariat that has a function of developing policies and strategies. I think this should be seen as a kind of forced generation, forced development platform or initiative. When it comes to the question on the Arctic Council and Russia, I think it's a highly relevant question, and I think it illustrates a weakness on the current setup on a governance model for the Arctic, because you have an Arctic Council and suddenly you end up in a situation where the council is kind of hijacked by big politics. And I understand, of course, the rationale behind continue business as usual with Russia as the chair. which would more or less be impossible. So I think you have to move in a direction for a more diversified governance model. And I take as an illustration what we had in Europe during the Cold War, where we developed multitude of institutions like the European Union, the Western European Union, we had NATO, we had the OSCE, and suddenly you find in a situation where you can move ahead in one of them, but not in all of them. So I think you need a new governance. I don't have a really good answer what to do in the immediate future. Maybe you have to wait out Russia's period as chair before you can open up and start dealing with Russia as a normal member. I don't think I don't know if that is politically acceptable in Washington, for instance, or in any of the other countries, but I do think we need a new governance model for the Arctic, where you have rather more institutions than a single source like we have now. Maybe that was not a answering for what to do in the immediate future, but I don't have a good answer to that. Sorry.
Rike, do you have a good answer for that?
Not really. I think this obviously has to be a high-level political decision, but it's a good question, but a difficult one to answer. I don't have a good answer to it, unfortunately.
Those are our favorite questions because we can always have a future webinar where we discuss that again. So we have two more questions here on Zoom. The first one is primarily for Rike. In your view, by Snorri Mathiasson, in your view, how has the renewed Russian invasion of Ukraine changed perceptions of China among Nordic publics? Do people conflate them with Russian aggression or see them as separate? And then Mark Letain says, thank you for excellent presentations to both of you. One, with Chinese firms backing away from certain projects in Siberia and concerned about international sanctions, how do you view the future of the Polar Silk Road, especially in the near-term future? And two, as more non-Arctic states are seeking to engage the far north and security concerns in this region are becoming more pressing, do you foresee the appearance of an Arctic treaty in some form? Thank you, Snorri and Mark, for those questions.
So thank you for your questions. Regarding your questions, Snorri, I do think that the Russian invasion has changed the perception of China more Nordic publics. I think people might not conflate them with Russian aggression, but it obviously negates China, as China is seen as a kind of an ally or helping Russia out and just moving its oil exports to China. At least that's how the rhetoric goes in Iceland. So definitely impacting China's image negatively. When it comes to Mark's question, I think that is a really good question. And actually there was a news article on the South China Morning Post about 5 Chinese companies might stop temporarily working on Russia's Arctic LNG 2 project this month. The reason cited is EU sanctions against Russia, but we will see whether this is truly the case or whether the project will continue as planned. But when it comes to the Polar Silk Road more broadly, I mean, we will have to see if the Polar Silk Road, will it only be China and Russia, or will the Polar Silk Road really go as intended and be the whole of the Arctic? Currently, I don't think so. I think it will be more limited to China and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answered your questions.
Can I add, Julian, on Mark's second question there about the Arctic Treaty, and I mean, I think that is very much in line with what I mentioned in my presentation about. I said something like observers status 2.0 and the need to develop a new governance model for the Arctic. And maybe I didn't specify this, but I think what is obvious is the need to include security-related issues in whatever model you have for the Arctic, because with the Arctic Council set up as it is, there with no discussion about security-related issues, not even crisis management things seriously. I think that is definitely something you need to do. And why not go the whole distance and go for an Arctic treaty that could specify both the institutional frameworks and the role and responsibility for both Arctic and non-Arctic states when it comes to trying to secure a peaceful and sustainable development of the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have promised everyone that I would be a very strict moderator and keep us under an hour. But first, I'll just very quickly see if Gabriele has any concluding remarks for us.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and thank you so much, Enrique and Mats, for excellent presentations. I think it's what we really have to try to find an answer to is to how are we going to deal with Russia and with China in the future? How are we doing to do this in an area which is very vulnerable and very sensitive towards many transformations? So I think the idea of having an Arctic treaty is something we have to really work on, or another governance body also in order to diversify the governance. I think these are very good things we can take away in order also to discuss this in the future. But not only, because now it's very important also to see the strategy, the evolving strategies of the countries we have in the European Arctic, and of course how Russia is going to what kind of what we are still going to expect from Russia in the next months to come. I think this is also very important. Nobody really knows because there is still a war going on. But yeah, thank you so much. And we will, of course, work on that issue. I mean, Julian mentioned it in the beginning. We are going to have more webinars, more seminars, also physical, in Stockholm, in Norway, and in Reykjavik, and of course, publications where I know some of you have been taking part, and also written articles. So thank you so much. We will be with you on the topic, and thank you, Julian, for an excellent moderation. See you soon, I hope.
It was my pleasure, and it's my turn to say thank you to both Rike and Mats. Thank you to everybody on Zoom and on YouTube who decided to join us live and spend your Tuesday afternoon with us here at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. A recording of this video will also be available on YouTube, so you can watch it at your leisure on Saturday morning. The conversation about the Arctic continues, and I'm hoping that both Rike and Mats will join us in future in other fora. You at home can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And now you can also sign up for our Cast Nordics newsletter, which also includes copious amounts of analysis on the Arctic. So I hope everybody will join me in giving virtual applause to Rike and Mats. And we hope to see you all again with us someday, both you, Rike and Mats, and of course, everybody who took part on Zoom and on YouTube. So that's it. Or sorry, Rike and Mats.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.